Hey everybody, this is James Lindsay. You are listening to the new Discourses podcast, and we are going to do another series. I know we're working a couple series at the same time right now, maybe a few of them, but we're going to do a series expanding on my idea of what I called in a previous podcast, the Nazi experiment. So if we're going to talk about the Nazi experiment, and I'll explain what the point of that previous podcast was briefly here in a second, we have to understand what the Nazi experiment was. And so in that previous podcast about the Nazi experiment, I talked about how I went through the second chapter of the first volume of Hitler's Mein Kampf, which is his manifesto for the Nazi Party. And I explained how the Germans at the time, in the 1920s in particular, were facing a variety of conditions that would include economic devastation, humiliation, this weird cultural war with France that was exacerbated by the application of the Treaty of Versailles, which the Germans saw as a absolutely unjust imposition on them and their nation, loss of territory, loss of standing, shattered economy, lots of problems. And that they came up with this solution that they ended up enacting. This also included the Weimar degeneracy and weak liberalism, decadent weak liberalism that was kind of ruling in the Weimar Republic. And they came up with this solution to this problem that I referred to as the Nazi experiment. So the point of the previous podcast was to articulate, A, what were the conditions that the Germans found themselves in 1920 to 1930. 1933 is when Hitler took power, at the beginning of 1933. So we can say 18 at the end of World War I until 1932, the end of that. So that period of time, spanning roughly 13 or 14 years, what was going on in the German mind and condition, and maybe extending after Hitler took power into the 1930s. And then that was number one. I wanted to explain the German condition that led to B, the Nazi experiment, which was supposed to be a solution to this bad set of conditions, particularly from the perspective of the wounded German. And the conclusion, C, was that this experiment was run and it was a catastrophe. So in other words, you might find yourself in similar conditions, lots of grievances, lots of problems, be those economic, cultural, or even political. And what the Nazis did becomes a cautionary tale for what we should not do to answer that circumstance. Okay, so that's the point of the podcast. The Nazi experiment was an attempted solution to a set of societal problems that ended in catastrophic failure and is therefore a cautionary tale that says, do not go that way. As it turns out, socialism isn't made better by making it nationalist too. The idea that blood and soil and nation can patch up the fundamental irreparable problems of a socialist program, that idea is false. It's not sufficient that people see themselves as part of a identity unit, be that racial, as in the case of the Nazis, or national, as in the case of all the fascist regimes, including the Nazis. It's just, or even, national in the sense of sharing the same land with the same sense of common destiny. It's not enough, because when you try to put that solution into practice, even though it's not identical to communism, as Hitler said in the chapter, by picking up the tools of the Marxists to use to drive home his own firm and fixed convictions, what happens is a catastrophe. So that was the point of the previous podcast. But if we're going to talk about the Nazi experiment, why don't we talk about the Nazi experiment? So in this podcast, which we'll expand to a series where we discuss the Nazi experiment, I'm going to go through more of Mein Kampf, and in particular the second volume, which is less read than his ranty first volume. Not that Hitler stops ranting. This is a very ranty, or a less ranty, more organized explanation of what the Nazi Party is supposed to represent at its its like deepest levels. What are its philosophical views that lead to the Nazi state, or as I'm phrasing it, the Nazi experiment, which again, I remind you, the point of calling it the Nazi experiment is that it was a set of conditions in which a set of human beings ran a trial. I was going to call it a controlled trial, but it's sort of an uncontrolled trial to address that set of conditions to see what would happen. And what happened was an utter catastrophe, the greatest world war and catastrophe you can really imagine. And so anyway, there's also a reason I want to do this isn't just to explain what the Nazi experiment is, but it's also to peel back. The woke right, whether you like that word or not, is telling a lot of stories about the Nazis that are simply not true. You should listen to Hitler's speeches. He's a great speechwriter. He just loved Germany, man. Or it wasn't really about the Jews, and it didn't become about the Jews until Churchill forced his hand in the middle of World War II. Then he didn't have anything to do. All this is wrong. All of this is easily read in Mein Kampf, which was published in 1925. And again, Hitler took power in 1933. World War II started in 1939. So we're talking a long time before that. The West really didn't get involved fully in the war until 1942, which is when, they allege all the real atrocities were forced into Hitler's hands, that he had to commit these atrocities to deal with the war and so on. And it turns out this is just not true. So we're going to pull back the curtain in this series. We're going to talk about the Nazi experiment, and we're going to see what Hitler really had in mind. So chapter 1 of the second volume of Mein Kampf is titled World Concept and Party. World concept is translated, I checked this from the German. I'm reading the Ford translation if anybody wants to know which translation I'm reading, and they can look it up themselves to follow along. But the word world concept in the Ford translation, at least according to both ChatGPT and Grok, is the word in the original German is Weltanschauung, which means worldview, just like the word in the critical constructivist book that Joe Kinchelow wrote, called Critical Constructivism, that I refer to as the Book of Woke, where he explains explicitly that it is a worldview, that critical constructivism is a worldview, a world concept in Hitler's language. And so this chapter is about the relationship. It's going to define the Nazi world concept or worldview and its relationship to the Nazi Party. And he starts off, as he usually does, with some historical rant. On the 24th of February, 1920, the first great public mass demonstration of our young movement took place in the banquet hall of the Munich Hofbrauhaus, an extension of the famous beer maker Hofbrau Brewery. The 25 points of our program, which I should go through at some point with you, were presented to a crowd of almost 2,000, and every single point was received with enthusiasm. We finally had an opportunity to make the first principles clear and explained our plan for action that would lead our struggle to clear away the chaos of traditional views and ideas, lest anybody ever tell you, by the way, that this was a conservative movement or anything other than a progressive movement. Let's just get rid of that lie. The Nazis were ultra progressives. If we think that communists and the Marxists are progressives, fascists are ultra progressive. They are more progressive, as I've explained in other places and other times, both in writing and in podcast, that they are progressives by reactionary means or progressives by regressive means, whereas the communists are actually more regressive, but they're this weird dialectical fusion of progressivism and regressivism. But I'm not getting caught in that tangent again. But here you hear it, right? They explained our plan for action that would lead our struggle to clear away the chaos of traditional views and ideas, just like Mao, you smash the four olds, and the vague, even harmful aims that were ever present. A new force had appeared to split the corrupt and cowardly privileged class world, and this force would shatter the Marxists' wave of conquest. And I'm going to pause again just to point out this is exactly the rationale the woke right is giving us, that there is a corrupt and cowardly privileged class and they have some ground to stand on. They are pointing to a true fact. Whether they call them the establishment Republicans, the uniparty, the globalists, the rhinos, they are positioning themselves or calling themselves a new force, a new right that has appeared to split the corrupt and cowardly privileged class world. That's the neocon, rhino, establishment, globo, homo, blah, 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 and force. And this force, he says, would shatter the Marxist wave of conquest. So the Marxists are the excuse and the target is the main traditional society. This movement, he said, would ride the chariot of fate in front of the Marxists' march to triumph and halt it at the last moment before it reached its goal. So again, Hitler's positioning the Nazi movement as the only way to stop communism, but his target is the chaos of traditional views and the corrupt and cowardly privileged class world. But they're going to be the anti-communists. So what are they actually going to attack? The mainstream. It was obvious, Hitler says, that the new movement's only hope to achieve the necessary significance and required strength for the gigantic struggle ahead was if it succeeded from the beginning in filling the hearts of its followers with the sacred conviction that we were not simply spouting a new election slogan into the political arena, but this new movement was placing a new world concept, Weltanschauung, one of great importance in front of the people. Think about how pitiful the programs of these other so-called party platforms are. And again, I remind you how close this sounds to the rhetoric of the woke right, talking about the establishment Republicans and the Republican Party overall, and increasingly conservatives overall. So they were going to fill the hearts of their followers with a sacred conviction that they're doing something completely new, and it has a new world concept, a new way of viewing the whole world that's of great importance. They're going to put it in front of the people because the other option is just, tweaking the status quo a little bit, and it's pitiful. It's a lot to think about here if you're Canadian, actually, right now, having watched Pierre Poilievre not win against Mark Carney recently. And when he did not win, a lot of the Canadian right piled on him and said that, I think partly rightly, that he didn't run a campaign that spoke to the heart of the conservative Canadian very well. He tried to put forth a pitiful program of these so-called party platforms. Hitler goes on, they are usually stuck together and shined up or reshaped from time to time, but one platform is basically the same as the next. That's exactly what the woke right say. To understand them, we must look at the motives which drive their construction. These motives, especially of the privileged class platform committees, must be put under the microscope so we can truly understand and judge how valuable these outrageous beliefs they call platforms are. So what we're going to do next, if Hitler broke this into sections instead of just a long rambling chapter, what we would be stepping into now is his explanation for why politics as usual is not acceptable. I'm not going to keep banging the drum. Actually, I probably will. I don't want to, but it's going to be irresistible that I want you to realize how close the rhetoric of the new right or dissident right or woke right is to this. And part of the reason I call them woke right is because they're woke in the same way that the Nazis were woke. And again, one of the slogans of the Nazis was Deutschland erwacht, or Deutschland awake, or awaken. I may have that backwards. It might be erwacht Deutschland, awake Germany, or whatever. It doesn't really matter which way that goes. The point is that the Nazis were a woke movement in Germany, and they were waking up to the fact that they'd been put under a false political consciousness, and this is what Hitler's talking about. And so if you want to call them new right or dissident right or whatever, I don't care. This is what they're actually talking about. And because it's a woke way of thinking about politics in the world, a woke worldview, which is rooted in critical theory, that's all that means, it stands to reason to call them woke. But I won't bang on that more now. Let's go on with Hitler. Hitler says there is only one reason which leads to the rewriting of party platforms or the modification of existing ones: the concern over who will win the next election. Whenever it begins to dawn on these parliamentary craftsmen that the good old common people are about to abandon the party and slip out of the harness of the old party bandwagon, the leaders repaint the bandwagon's wheels. So you understand what he's doing, right? He's saying that the point of a political reform movement is not, in fact, to change anything. It's to keep winning elections as best they can. He says, then the so-called experienced and shrewd, usually the old parliamentarians, these are the stargazers, the party astrologers who can recall a similar crisis. That's what they can accuse me of here now, and their long political apprenticeship when the people's patience ended and mass defections loomed. They feel the same kind of calamity drawing dangerously near, so they resort to the standard formulas, form a committee, listen to what the good old common people are saying, sniff at the newspapers, and gradually smell out what the common people want, what they hate, and what they hope for. Every trade and business group and every class of employee is carefully studied as its most secret wishes are examined. Even the, quote, empty catchwords, which are used by the now dangerous opposition, are suddenly re-examined. Frequently, to the surprise of those who first coined these phrases, they suddenly appear quite innocent, as if the ideas were taken for granted or obvious. Some of them are even found in the intellectual library of the old parties. So the committees meet, quote, revise the old platform and write a new one in a way that gives everyone what he wants. The parliamentary class changes their convictions just as the soldier changes his shirt in the field. Whenever the old one wears out, no one is left out. The farmer's agriculture is protected, the industrialist's products are protected, the consumer is guaranteed stable market prices, the teacher's salaries are raised, and the civil servants' pensions are improved. The state is to take good care of widows and orphans, commerce is promoted, prices are to be lowered, and taxes are to be practically abolished. Sometimes one group may have been forgotten, or a new demand among the people was not discovered by the party in time to add this revision. Any overlooked concessions are stuck on wherever there is space at the last moment. The patches are put in place until the party can faithfully hope that the army of middle-class Philistines and their wives are soothed and satisfied once again. Now armed with faith in the Lord and the unshakable stupidity of the voting citizens, the party can begin the struggle for reshaping the Reich, as it is called. When Election Day is over and the parliamentarians have held their last mass meeting for 5 years, with no further need to consider the commoners, they focus on fulfillment of their higher and more pleasant duties. The committee that created this new platform disbands again, and the struggle for reshaping assumes the form of a battle for one's daily bread. Maybe this is why gatherings of parliamentarians are called diets. It says here as a note, an alternate meaning of diet is a formal legislative assembly. The parliamentarians draw their daily pay by simply showing up, and the struggle degrades into a humdrum daily routine. Again, I urge you to think of how much of this kind of rhetoric that you've heard, and the scarier fact that much of it touches reality. Because the point of the Nazi experiment, if you recall, is that there were lots of problems in reality, and the Nazi experiment was proposed as a solution, and the result was a catastrophe. It's not that Hitler was basing everything he did on an incorrect reading of the circumstance. In fact, he's often quite observant. It is that he had an incorrect diagnosis and an incorrect prescription that followed a different path than should have been taken. And how do we know it's a different path than should have been taken? We can look at the result of the Nazi experiment, how it ended up. And we can see it ended with Hitler shooting himself in a bunker while his country was utterly destroyed and disgraced for a century. And by the way, he didn't stop the communists. They ended up controlling half of his country, and that didn't, in a very short order, and that didn't exactly succeed in stopping them. Every morning, the honorable gentleman, he says, the deputy of the parliament, goes to the house, and though he may not make it all the way in, He at least goes as far as the entryway where the attendance lists are kept. He labors strenuously for the people by entering his name there and receives his well-deserved reward in the shape of a small payment for his long and exhausting efforts. After 4 years, just about the time their term of service is to expire, or during other critical periods when the end of session for the parliamentary body draws nearer and nearer, these gentlemen suddenly feel an irresistible urge come over them, and they have a desire to take action. Just as the caterpillar cannot help turning into a butterfly, these parliamentarian worms leave the home of their species and flutter out on new-found wings to the good old common people. Once more they speak to the voters, telling them about their own tremendous accomplishments and the stubbornness of their opponents, but sometimes they encounter rude and unfriendly expressions thrown at them from the stupid masses instead of grateful applause. I'm going to pause here and point out that Hitler has signaled twice now how stupid he thinks people are, and signaled, therefore, twice that he believes himself to be elite, above the stupid people, and therefore there's an element of projection, even if he's right in the accusation he's making. And the Nazi experiment takes on a tone. Part of the problem that they were identifying at the time in Germany, and I say they because I don't just mean the Nazis, in general, part of the political problem that was being identified in the 1920s in Germany was a political class that was detached from the people. Well, that's a problem. Hitler proposed a solution, and it is not the only solution. It is not that you need this rampant new movement bred of a rabid worldview-infused populism. It is in fact possible that that a political movement could arise that's actually meant to be in contact with the people without the fanaticism and the weird world concept. You could retain the world concept that you have, the Weltanschauung, the connection to reality, ideally, individual freedom and liberty, and actually work to connect to people, which is what the people actually want. They don't want a mass movement of insanity, but they also don't want the corrupt, detached political class. Therefore, Hitler poses out that there are these two options, this or that, and he has the solution. And we saw where his solution led, into the dumpster of history, the ash heap of history, the Mount Doom of history, the cracks of doom of history. He says, once more they speak to the voters, telling them about their own tremendous accomplishments and the stubbornness of their opponents, but sometimes they encounter rude and unfriendly expressions thrown at them from the stupid masses, instead of grateful applause. If this lack of gratitude from the people rises beyond a certain level, there is only one thing that can save the day. The glory of the party must be shined up again, and surely the party platform needs more repairs. The party platform committee is set up, and the charade begins all over again. Considering the rock-solid stupidity of the public, Hitler is not a man of the folk, whatever you want to believe. We cannot be surprised. People, these woke right guys trying to launder Hitler, say he loved the German people. Let's just read that again. Considering the rock-solid stupidity of the presumably German public. That's 3 times in one page. He's called them stupid. Here, rock-solid stupidity. He is not a man of the people. That was not what this was about. It was an elite vanguard model that he stole from the Nazis, from the communists, as he said earlier in the book. So considering the rock-solid stupidity of the public, we cannot be surprised at the resulting success of these tactics. The politicians keep tricking the public because they're so stupid. That's why what you need is a emotional mental illness movement instead. That clearly didn't work out. Steered by its newspapers and blinded by the attractive new party program, the privileged class, notice the language here, the privileged class and the working class combine into a united voting herd as they go back into their old stalls and elect the same old deceivers. Then the, quote, man of the people and the, quote, candidate of the working class is transformed back into a parliamentary caterpillar where he can continue gorging himself as he clasps to the branches of state life, where he will only where he will only to be transformed into a glittering butterfly again only 4 years later. There's nothing more depressing than watching the whole process in sober reality and seeing the never-ending fraud for oneself. So that's Hitler's analysis, and I just strongly urge you to realize that the Nazi experiment includes a prescriptive elite theory, as it's been phrased. He believes that the Nazi vanguard is elite, that they understand the world and politics better than not just these parliamentarians who are tricking the masses, but of the rock-solid, stupid masses too. So they're going to usher people into the ideal system because the people are too stupid to choose the ideal system for themselves, which is why they're not going to be able to have liberty, which is why you end up in fascism and National Socialism with a totalitarian system, as Benito Mussolini said explicitly about the fascist project in his own country, that it was totalitarian in nature on purpose. The privileged class camp, Hitler goes on, the privileged class camp of politicians cannot draw enough spiritual strength from this kind of self-indulgent dealing to fight a battle with the organized power of Marxism. So there's their problem. They're too weak. They can't fight the actual thing. So what you need is a radical, angry movement that's dedicated itself to attacking the monster by any means. These upper-class people never seriously thought of battling them at all. With the admitted limitations and intellectual inferiority in these parliamentary snake oil salesmen who are supposed to represent the white race, where did that come from? Where did that part come from? Whoops, it was about parliamentarians and weak politicians and self-dealing politicians, which is admittedly a real problem. But their problem is that they're supposed to represent the white race, according to Hitler. How can they remember the woke right wants us to believe that race wasn't a part of this for Hitler? That was actually forced on him way later. This is published in 1925. With the admitted limitations and intellectual inferiority in these parliamentarian snake oil salesmen who are supposed to represent the white race, how can they seriously expect to make any progress using Western democracy against a doctrine that at best is designed as the means to destroy democracy? So, once again, we see the rhetoric of the woke right. Rehashed Hitler is what you're dealing with. Or rehashed fascism, actually, because Hitler's borrowing heavily from Mussolini in this organizational project, except the world concept, as we will hear. Marxism, he says, is the means to an end. It's tactics. It's just tactics. That's what he's saying. Marxism is the means to an end, and that end is the destruction of Western democracy by paralyzing the political body, which in turn leaves the path open for itself. For now, that's actually a good analysis of how Marxism works, by the way, but it's not what Marxism is. For now, one part of Marxism very shrewdly tries to pretend it is connected to the principles of democracy, but we must never forget, remember our democracy, but we must never forget that when the critical moment is upon us and Marxism is breathing down our necks, these privileged class legislators did not think a penny's worth of their time could be sacrificed to reach a majority decision on the protection of Western democratic principles. So I've talked a little bit here and there about recruiting on the third rail. This is a tactic that woke demagogues will use. They step into a space that is taboo space, so people are uncomfortable talking about it. And in this case, they're uncomfortable talking about the fact that the politicians themselves are corrupt. And they recruit by being the people who will stand on that third rail where you're not allowed to go and not allowed to talk. And they will say bold and sometimes actually crazy things in the absence of saner discussion. And this is an extremely effective tactic. We see it in a lot of places, whether it's the woke right stepping into anti-Semitism to recruit people who can be led to hate Jews or Israel, whether it's the woke right stepping into racism to recruit there, or weird manosphere, anti-feminist, patriarchal, whatever, women-hating there, whether it's the gay hatred over there, whether it's this weird political forceful, I think they sometimes call it muscular Christianity. With the Christian nationalist movement, they step into these third rail positions and nobody will argue back against them. And then they're the only voices in those spaces, so they get to dominate and they get to recruit against the apparent weakness. So the lesson here is that it is our duty to have politicians who will actually take up this fight. Hitler's claim is that that's not possible outside of a mass movement that rejects the entire system as it is. And it is possible, but it's necessary that we do whatever we can to make sure that we get the politicians who are actually going to do the things that we need to do. That's what MAGA tried to do in 2024, and it's being co-opted by this woke right movement who will increasingly try to squeeze Trump into their mold, or if they can't, eventually they will turn on him. That's the program. So Hitler continues, these privileged class parliamentarians believe the security of the Reich is guaranteed by the monumentally superior numbers on their side, so they remain blind while Marxism snatches power with a crowd of thugs, deserters, political evangelists, and Jewish amateur intellects. These legislators are giving the current democracy a resounding slap in the face with through their failure to act. So notice the invocation of Jewish amateur intellects already. But remember, Hitler wasn't anti-Semitic allegedly until way later. That's what the woke right want us to believe. Only a legislator, they obviously, by the way, haven't read chapters 10 or 11 of the first volume of this book, or much of the rest of it, like the second chapter, which I already read to you guys, and where he exposes that his whole program is openly anti-Semitic and built around anti-Semitism. But anyway, I mean anti-Semitism as the actual conspiracy theory of Jews controlling the world and ruining societies, but also combined with Jew hatred, which I see as actually a different thing that we should be careful to distinguish between. He goes on, he says, only a legislator with the devout spirit of a witch doctor could possibly believe that the wicked determination of those who support and profit from this Marxist plague could be halted simply by uttering the magic spell of Western democracy. So Hitler is actually right. You do actually have to do something. We have to be willing to sue. We have to be willing to fire people. We have to be willing to assert the law. Turns out Marxism violates a lot of the laws that it has manipulated in its favor, such as in the United States, the Civil Rights Act. A race-blind application of the Civil Rights Act would destroy most of the DEI industry overnight. Of course, the woke right says that the problem's the Civil Rights Act, so let's get rid of it, so we wouldn't have that tool in our toolbox anymore. And the demagoguery would lead to other less pleasant solutions. Marxism, he tells us, will march alongside democracy until it indirectly succeeds in gaining support for its criminal intentions from the very nationalist intellectual world which Marxism has marked for extermination. That is a correct statement about Marxism. If Marxist leaders become convinced today that somewhere in the witch's cauldron of our parliamentary democratic system, a numerical majority might suddenly be brewed which would furiously combat Marxism, the parliamentary hocus pocus would be over in an instant. Instead of appealing to the democratic conscience, the flag bearers of the Red International Movement would be Instead of appealing to the democratic conscience, so if you challenge the Marxists for real, here's what would happen. Instead of appealing to the democratic conscience, the flag bearers of the Red International Movement would send out a fiery call to action to the working class masses, and their battle would jump from the stuffy air of our parliamentary chambers into the factories and spill out onto the streets. This is also correct in terms of how they operate, which is why it's so important to expose Marxism for what it is and how it operates. Democracy, he says, would immediately be over with the intellectual prowess of these. So what he's saying is that the Marxists will use infiltration and subversion as far as they can, and when they hit a roadblock, they'll switch to revolutionary tactics. And it will be incumbent upon people to stand up to those revolutionary tactics as well. That's necessary. But that doesn't mean that the Nazi experiment was the only way or even a good way to do it. It was neither. Democracy, he said, would immediately be over. What the intellectual prowess of these parliamentary apostles of the people had failed to accomplish in the parliament would now be accomplished by the crowbar and the sledgehammer wielded by the excited working class masses who would achieve the Marxist goals in a flash, just as in the fall of 1918. With one crushing blow, they would teach the privileged class world how crazy it was to think that one can resist the Jewish world conquest with the tools of Western democracy. So it's easy to harp on the fact that he swapped out Marxist for Jewish here. We already know that that's one of his things. He made that very clear in the previous episode that I recorded from the second chapter of the first volume. So way back in the book, if you were following along with the whole thing. But what's more important here is, again, to remind you that here he's pointing to a real issue with Marxists and how Marxists operate and how the privileged class elite, as he calls them, fail to recognize it satisfactorily and then fail to realize what the Marxists will do if they mount any defense at all. So normally they go along with it, and if they don't and resist, the Marxists will take it to the streets, and then you end up with Jesse Singal, who's constantly flabbergasted. He's baffled that they would do this, and Hitler is talking about these people. So obviously the point is that those people shouldn't be the ones setting opinions or in charge either. We have to have people that have the spine to stand up to the Marxists in positions of power. We also have to have public servants who serve the Constitution and uphold it, who are also willing to uphold it and to enforce the law when the Marxists go into the streets, and to put people in jail as necessary, or whatever the other tools are to put down their physical rebellion. The Nazi experiment is being repeated now. This is my point. This is why I recorded a podcast called Never Again Is Now. The Nazi experiment is being repeated now. But we already know what happens when you run the Nazi experiment, and it doesn't matter how arrogant these people are, thinking that they're going to be the ones who make it work right in the American context or the European context or somewhere outside of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. That's just utter intellectual arrogance. It's just more being high on your own supply, narcissistic nonsense that these cults always display. But let's carry on with Hitler. As I've said before, it requires a trusting soul to honor the rules of the game. Listen to how similar this sounds. It requires a trusting soul to honor the rules of the game when he is faced with an opponent who sees the rules only as a masquerade for his own benefit, and then the instant he no longer finds those rules give him an advantage, he throws them overboard. So they're evil, so we have to be evil back. This is the argument. Because they're not going to follow the rules, we have to stop following the rules. You hear this argument all the time. Guess where it comes from? That should put a chill in your spine. In all political parties of privileged class orientation, the entire political struggle consists of a scramble for individual seats in Parliament. During this time, they adhere to convictions and principles until those principles begin to weigh them down, and then they are tossed overboard as easily as bags of sand. Naturally, their political platforms and programs are set up in a similar way so they can be discarded just as quickly. The party's strength is measured by that scale, but in reverse, the more weight they discard, the more bogged down they become, and hence the weaker they become. They don't have that powerful magnetic attraction which the great masses want to follow. Oh, there's the spellbinding aspect, the wizard's circle, the emotional capture, the deviation from logos into pathos that we've talked about all along with woke movements. They don't have that powerful magnetic attraction which the great masses want to follow, that aura. That's the word that the kids use, right? That aura of an irresistible impression of great and outstanding principles, and of the convincing force of unconditional faith in those principles, along with the fanatical fighting courage to defend them. This is woke right. I could be reading this off of any of the woke right publications or blogs or Substacks, and you wouldn't tell the difference, except that I'm reading the first chapter of the second volume of Mein Kampf, which is where he sets up the Nazi Party. At a time when one side, he says, armed with all the weapons of a world concept, aka Weltanschauung, that's the Marxists, even though it is absolutely criminal, prepare. So, by the way, Hitler did not say that Marxism is just tactics. He actually said that it is a world concept and a worldview, and that gives it its actual power. So when you hear these guys say out there in the woke right saying Marxism is just a bunch of tactics, it absolutely is not. He knew there was a world concept, so there's going to be answering it with a different world concept. And they actually say that that's the thing, and that's why they can justify picking up the tactics. So at a time when one side, he means the Marxist, armed with all the weapons of a Weltanschauung, a worldview, even though it is absolutely criminal, that's Marxism, prepares for the attack on an existing order the other side can successfully resist only if it covers itself in the form of a new, it has to be new. There's no possibility of strengthening what is there. It must be a new, and he says, in our case, political faith. But that's exactly the argument the woke right has been making. That's exactly the argument that the Yoram Hazony from NatCon made, is that when you are faced with these neo-Marxists, he says, sounding like Grima Wormtongue, it seems to me that the only thing that we can answer it with is a stronger force. They have a political faith, and we need a political faith. That's literally what Yoram Hazony says. And people are going to flip out. Yoram Hazony is an Orthodox Jew and an Israeli. You can't compare him to Hitler. I'm not comparing him to Hitler. I'm saying he said the same damn thing as Hitler. At a time when the Marxists are armed with all the weapons of a worldview, even though it is absolutely criminal, and it prepares for attack on an existing order, the other side can successfully resist only if it covers itself in the form of a new and, in our case, political faith. It has to be a religion that drives the people into religious zealotry and exchanges, he says, the catchwords of a weak and cowardly defense for the battle cry of a bold and brutal attack. So people get really mad at me that I said that NatCon is woke right. National conservatism, which, if we were being cheeky, since they say that they're an American Workers' Party, we could call the National Conservative American Arbeiter Party in comparison to the Hitler's National Socialist, not National Conservative, National Socialist German Workers' Party. I mean, just saying. People say, why is it woke right? Well, I don't know. Here's the exact same logic as something that I think is quintessentially woke in the sense of being a woke reactionary movement, which is literally the building of the Nazi Party. We're going to have to cover ourselves in the form of a new political faith in order to resist. That's the only option. And I can't help that the creator of National Conservatism, Yoram Hazony, in an interview said exactly that. And the clip has gone around the social media somewhat virally not that long ago. And we can definitely see it again. If someone, Hitler tells us, especially one of the so-called nationalist privileged class ministers, like a Bavarian centrist, accuses our movement, who are the Bavarian centrists, right? So one of the so-called nationalist privileged class ministers, like a Bavarian centrist, accuses our movement of working for an upheaval. So that's people who don't want a revolution. There is just one possible answer to such a political tom thumb. Right you are. We are trying to make good what you and your criminal stupidity failed to do. You and your principles of parliamentary position jockeying helped to drag the nation into a black pit, but we will aggressively set up a new world concept and with fanatical fervor unshakably defend its principles. We will build the steps that our people will one day be able to again climb to the temple of freedom. That's what you're supposed to say back to people who say, maybe we don't want a revolution. Maybe we should stand by the Constitution. Those political tom-thumbs. When our movement was founded, Hitler tells us, we devoted our primary efforts toward preventing our army of fighters for a new and higher conviction from turning into a mere society for furthering of parliamentary interests. The first preventative, so we have to destroy the status quo for a completely new system. The first preventative measure was the creation of a program that urged the development of a party whose inner greatness was designed and calculated to frighten off the petty, weak minds of our present party politicians. Sounds familiar. The soundness and necessity of our idea to establish a sharp definition of our program's aims was best shown by those fatal programs which led to Germany's collapse. The recognition of the problems faced by Germany was bound to give shape to a new state concept, which in turn is an essential element in a new world concept. Again, that's Worldview or Weltanschauung in German. In the first volume, I dealt with the word racialist, he tells us. So here we have a new section. So he says that we're going to need a new political religion based on a new worldview that's going to adopt the brutal tactics to fight back. That's that section. Because our parliamentarians are too weak, our rhinos are too weak, the neocons have sold us out. That's that section. And now he's going to switch to a new section where he talks about that world concept which defines the Nazi state concept. And the worldview or world concept that he talks about is given here. In the first volume, I dealt with the word racialist, pointing out that this designation is too obscurely defined as an idea to allow it to form a solid fighting group. There are many groups that are as different as night and day floating around at this time under the blanket name racialist. So racialist was the word that was used in place of what we use now as racism. Racism arose in France from a reactionary, anti-Semitic, far right-wing lunatic in the 1902 or thereabouts, got picked up eventually, didn't really start to gain prominence until it started getting applied to what the Nazis were doing. And a lot of the woke right commentary will tell you that the word was applied primarily by communists to the Nazis, the word racist, in order to discredit them. But what I'm pointing to you here is that Hitler is embracing the freaking word in Mein Kampf as the world concept for his program, not as something they do, as the central driving force of their political religion. James, you're exaggerating. There are many groups that are as different as night and day floating around at this time under the blanket name racialist. So before I go on to explain the aims of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, I would like to clarify the idea of racialist and its relation to the party movement. The word racialist is vague. It does not clearly express any specific idea, and it is subject to many interpretations. And it is limitless in practical application. It is as limitless in practical application as, for instance, the word religion. It is also difficult for us to create a clear picture in our minds about what it means, either for theoretical or practical descriptions. The term religious becomes concrete only when it is connected with a sharply defined form, which is actually practiced. It sounds very pretty to say someone is deeply religious, but that is usually a hollow statement, for it says nothing about a man's character. We're learning that, aren't we? There may be a very few individuals who feel themselves satisfied by such a general term, and others who might even assign to it a definite picture of a particular spiritual state, but the great masses are not made up of philosophers or saints. Again, he's not big fans of the masses. An absolutely general and non-specific religious idea like this will be turned into the listener's personal interpretation. It does not lead to an effective inner religious craving that one possesses when the purely abstract and unlimited world of ideas shapes itself into a clearly defined faith. This is not an end in itself, but only a means to the end. However, the means is the essential way of attaining the end. This end is by no means solely a theoretical idea, but the bottom line is that it is extremely practical. In fact, we must realize that generally, the highest ideals always correspond to a profound vital necessity in our lives, just as the nobility we see in beauty is ultimately determined by a form that is logical and useful in the end. The beauty of form follows its function. Faith, he tells us, helps to raise men above the level of a mere animal existence, and it contributes to strengthening and safeguarding his existence. His religious training includes religious doctrine, but in practicality also includes morals, ethics, and the principles it supports. If you eliminate this religious training, it will result in a critical weakening of the foundations of his existence. It is safe to say that man lives to serve higher ideals, but these higher ideals are also the essentials for his existence as a man, and the circle is complete. So notice the invocation of the circle, those of you that pay attention to the Hermetic stuff and the Hegelian stuff, but also listen to what he's doing. Can you predict where he's going with this? It's actually really transparent. This isn't a random rant about religion. He's saying that when you talk about being religious, that doesn't mean anything. Even being deeply religious, that doesn't mean anything until you specify the faith. And when you specify the faith, it becomes very real and practical, and it defines what makes him a man. It defines who he is. So a man needs a well-defined, concrete religion that he can wholly commit to on all levels. That's the argument he's making. What do you think he's going to suggest that religion should be? If you think it's Christianity, I've got a bridge to sell you. If that's what you were thinking, I have a bridge to sell you. He mentions Christianity from time to time, but the Nazis had this thing called positive Christianity that wasn't Christianity at all. You can tell what it served. He's going to substitute in place of this glorified, motivating, enlivening, humanizing dimension of specific religion, the Nazi world concept. The political faith, he said, we have to have. It's all set up. He says even the general term, he's got to rant more about the word for a page or two. Even the general term religious, he says, implies certain basic ideas or convictions. Some of these are the immortality of the soul, the belief in eternal life, and the existence of a higher being. These ideas, though firmly believed as factual by the individual, are still subject to the interpretation of that individual and subject to his acceptance or rejection of them if the emotional power behind them does not take on the force of an undeniable law that is the doctrine that defines a clear faith. More than anything else, this doctrine is the fighting element which breaks through the outer appearance of fundamental religious views and pushes those superficial theoretical trappings aside to clear the path for a deep and committed faith. Without a clearly defined faith, the multiple vague forms of religious feeling followed by individuals would not only be worthless for human life, but probably would contribute to general disintegration. I'm just going to pause and again remind you that if you think he's talking about being Christian, I've got a bridge to sell you. This ain't about Jesus, ladies and gentlemen. He says the same analysis for religion is true for the term racialist. It too embodies certain basic ideas, but these, even though of outstanding importance, are so vague in form that they have no value beyond an opinion more or less deserving of recognition. The ideals of a world concept, or Weltanschauung, and the requirements deduced from them are not understood by pure feeling or men's inner will any more than freedom is conquered by a universal desire for it. No, only when the idealistic— Again, let me pause and point out that it is an idealistic, aka progressive movement. Only when the idealistic longing for independence is organized to fight in the form of a military force can the compelling desire of a people be transformed into a splendid reality. Even a world concept, again, Weltanschauung, worldview, that is totally sound and of the utmost value for humanity will never have any practical value, and will never shape the people's lives until its principles have become the banner of a fighting movement. So here's your Christ is King, guys. Yeah, so Christianity, maybe it is a totally sound worldview of the utmost value for humanity, to say what Hitler's saying, but it's not going to have any practical value unless, or shape people's lives, unless it's turned into the banner of a fighting movement, a crusade. The movement, he says, will remain a party until its work has been completed by bringing its ideas victory, and its party doctrines form the new state whose principles shape the community. In other words, you're going to have to force the religion through the state, no matter what that religion is. And notice that he's saying this in the midst of talking about racialism, which is the word that means racism, as he's going to say shortly, is the world concept for Nazism. If an abstract intellectual concept is to serve as the foundation for future development, the first requirement is to create a clear understanding of the nature, the character, and the extent of this idea. This is the only way a movement can be founded so that it maintains the inner cohesion and uniformity of its convictions, and from this uniformity, it will develop the necessary strength for the battle. General concept, so it's definitely revolutionary, by the way. This is why I recoil when I see people, some of whom I think work at Doge, post on Twitter that they're not conservative, they are radical right-wing revolutionaries. General concepts, Hitler tells us, must be molded into a political program, a general world concept into a definite political faith. We have left Christianity behind, ladies and gentlemen. Since its aim must be one that is I think molding your worldview into a definite political faith is a great definition for woke, by the way. Is it not? Isn't that great? That's a great definition for woke. So in order to succeed, you have to be woke, is what he's saying. Since its aim must be one that is within reach and can be accomplished in the real world, this faith must not only serve the idea, but it must include the means that will be used to fight and to win victory for the idea. So it's not just the world concept, but the tactics that come with it. Along with the it's not just theory, but praxis. Along with a theoretically sound intellectual idea, which was originally declared by the program maker. He's mystifying everybody, by the way, in the Hegelian sense by going way into the abstract here. So you don't actually know what he's talking about and you're buying in. So then when he concretizes it on race, it's all going to seem like, oh yeah, I follow. Yeah, that made sense. Along with the theoretically sound intellectual idea, which was originally declared by the program maker, the politician must use his practical insight to shape the idea into an achievable plan. An eternal ideal that is the guiding star of humanity must adjust itself so that it takes into account the weaknesses inherent in man because of a general human imperfection. And only then can it avoid failure the instant it begins. The founder, which Hitler's general weakness is that humans are stupid. They have to be led like sheep. They have to be told what to do by the Führerprinzip, by the strict organizational structure of the Nazi program. The founder of the idea, the explorer of truth, must be joined by the man who knows the people's spirit. This is so Marxist, it's not even funny. And they must work together in order to extract what is humanly possible for tiny mortals from the realm of ideals and eternal truth and give it shape that can be used in the fight. P.S. That's progressivism. This is very, very, very progressive, hyper-progressive. This transformation of a general and idealistic world concept into a definite, tightly organized political fighting brotherhood of faith, in other words, the dialectic from abstract to concrete in Hegelian language. So the fighting brotherhood of faith, he says, which is unified in both mind and will, is the most significant achievement we can hope for. Any chance of victory for the idea depends completely on this successful transformation of an idea into a practical plan. So you have to have solutions. It's not enough to explain or criticize. You have to know what to do. You have to have a plan. You have to have solutions. Like, filing lots of lawsuits and getting involved at the local level in politics, which are hard and ugly things to do, don't count as solutions because it's not an emotive mass movement, which is what they mean by solutions. This is what the woke right are always telling us. So Hitler goes on, he says, out of a crowd of millions who individually have at least some understanding of these truths, and a few who may fully understand them, one man must arise who can form a clear and rock-solid principle. This man will create a force out of the shifting tide of understanding that exists in the broad masses, and this force will be so strong it cannot be doubted. So like I talked about when I had my interview with Jordan Peterson recently, that the structure of the parasitical psychopathic model is always such that it's going to be done in the name of the masses or the people, but it's organized such that the guy who's cooking it up is going to be on top and run the whole show as a dictator. It's always like this because it's always a narcissistic cult trying to take over society. That's the nature of the tyrannical or totalitarian program. He says, this man will create a force out of the shifting tide of understanding that exists in the broad masses, and this force will be so strong that it cannot be doubted. He must fight to make the truth of these ideas exclusive, so that no others can be considered. Like you might purge or cancel anybody who doesn't go along. You're going to mock everybody else out of the table, off the table, especially people who have been fighting close by you but don't share your radical ambitions. Right? He must fight to make the truth of these ideas so exclusive so that no others can be considered and continue. That's why they have to take down the Daily Wire. Other ideas might be considered, which is exactly the same thing that Herbert Marcuse said about repressive tolerance. It's the same tyranny. And he must continue in his fight until he creates an unshakable rock out of man's will, and a single solid belief rises from a world of free-flowing and shaky ideas. The right to take such action comes from necessity, and the right of the particular man to take this action is justified by his success. So winning justifies whatever you do to win. That's the cult of winning that we see in the woke right. I don't know if this is scaring the living crap out of you or not yet, but it did me when I read this. It is now that I'm reading, this is I think the fourth time I've read through this chapter, and I'm like, holy crap. So now we come back to the word racialist. When we try to find the inner core meaning of the word racialist, Hitler tells us, we come to the following conclusion. The ordinary concept that exists in politics is that the state in itself has no creative and cultural energy it can use to build a civilization, but it has no understanding of the essentials of race in the creation of the state. So his political religion, his worldview, that's going to motivate everything, that will be justified through winning, is going to be racialist. Like I told you, it is not going to be Christian, it is going to be racialist. The state is thought to be more of a product of economic necessities, or at best, the natural result of a political lust for power. So this is all the arguments you're hearing from the woke right, which mirror the exact same arguments on the woke left, that capitalism just reduces human beings to interchangeable parts that could be traded out, that are fungible, and it's all about GDP. The state is thought to be more of a product of economic necessities, or at best a natural result of a political lust for power. If we extend this view to its logical conclusions, that's the same criticism Hitler's giving, it leads to a misconception of racial forces, which are what matter, which is when we hear them talk about how the natural solution to the failures of Marxism is to keep the socialism and use kinship and identity and nationalism as the antidotes that fill in the gaps. Hitler said what was missing from the program of socialism is the racial identity concept. Same exact argument. Then that's going to be forged into a national identity concept that causes people to activate. So if we extend this view to its logical conclusion, it leads to a misconception of racial forces, and it leads to the idea that the individual is of little importance. If we deny the atomized individual, right? If we deny that the different races vary in respect to their general powers of creativeness and their own culture, we hear this argument all the time from the racial realists, then this must mean that when we evaluate the individual person, he too does not vary in his powers of creativity, so that the individual become fungible, interchangeable parts for the economy. That's their literal argument. The assumption that the races are alike leads to a similar attitude toward peoples, thereby toward individual men. Consequently, international Marxism itself is just the transformation by the Jew Karl Marx, by the way, that's not true, of a long existing world concept, meaning the liberal one or the free society one, into a definite political profession of faith. So this is the same argument the woke right make, that the idea of a free society which treats people as political equals and does not consider their race as a key formative piece of who they are, naturally extends into a profession of political faith when the Jew Karl Marx gets a hold of it and turns it into a world concept of communism. That's literally, again, the exact argument the woke right is making right now. Where did it come from? Chapter 1, Volume 2 of Hitler's Mein Kampf, published in 1925. James, how do you dare call these people woke? They're not woke. James just wants to discredit people and associate them with Nazis. I am not the one trying to associate you with anything that you aren't saying exactly for yourself. Without the widespread pre-existing foundation of such a poison, that's Marxism, but the widespread pre-existing foundation is a free society. This is Hitler's argument, the same one the woke right is making now. The amazing political success of this doctrine would never have been possible. Among millions of people, Karl Marx was the one man who, with the sure eye of the prophet, recognized, so Karl Marx has some good arguments, recognized the poisons essential to his plan were already in the swamp of a slowly decaying world. He separated and identified those poisons like a black magic wizard to make a concentrated solution he could use to speed the destruction of the free nations on this earth. All this was done, with no evidence, he says, to serve his race. So at the bottom here, what was Karl Marx's race? He just said the Jew. So this is the anti-Semitism is all there. Liberalism is a failed world project that the Jewish communists figured out how to boil down into an assault against free nations in order to serve their own race. Because in essence, according to Hitler, who is a racialist, that's actually what everybody does, in particular the Jews. So we have to engage in a racial conflict because everybody else is engaging in a racial conflict, and we can't defend ourselves if we don't. This is woke right 101. Marxist doctrine, he tells us, is the extract of the intellectual soul of today's universal, that's the liberal that they're talking about in the woke right today, world concept that is boiled down into a concentrated form. So get this straight, Hitler's making the same argument, that communism is an extension of classical liberalism. For that reason alone, any struggle against it... So let me pause, because my good English friend Carl Benjamin recoils when I associate him, who's an intellectual apparently, with the Nazis and the Jew haters, because Carl Benjamin does not hate Jews. That's aka Sargon of Akkad. He does not hate Jews, so far as I can tell. I'm pretty sure he doesn't. He's told me to his face that he hates the anti-Semitism and he wants nothing to do with it, and that I'm casting too broad of a brush. We had a very cordial conversation face to face. We got along very well. I'm not putting Carl down. But Carl says exactly this argument, and then it says it's insulting that you associate me with these outright open anti-Semitic people like the Groypers. You're making the same argument, though. You're not saying the same things as the Groypers, and you probably don't feel most of the same things as the Groypers. But your argument that liberalism is exactly the condition by which the Marxist is able to take over, and that part of it is that he's destroying the national identity located partly in the race, is exactly Hitler's argument. You just aren't calling Marx a Jew when you do it, Carl. But it's the same exact argument. This isn't close. It's the same exact argument. So again, we start. Marxist doctrine is the extract of the intellectual soul of today's universal world concept, liberal worldview, that is boiled down into a concentrated form. For that reason alone, any struggle against it by our privileged class is impossible. That's literally what Benjamin says. And I would even say such a fight would be ridiculous. He says literally that liberals cannot resist communism because they actually are the swamp from which communism is distilled. It's the same argument. These sentences are the same thing. This is, I guess, why he has to come out and defend Marx or whatever makes him do it. He says, Hitler says, the privileged class world is already saturated with all these Marxist poisons. It has already declared its devotion to a similar world concept which differs from the Marxist concept only in its degree and in the character of the privileged class people who hold the beliefs. The privileged class world is Marxist, but they believe they can somehow dominate and keep the privileged class in control. However, true Marxism works day and night to deliver the world into the hands of, you think, the communist, right? No, the Jew. Once again, the anti-Semitism was there all along. And then Hitler continues with the answer. The racialist, remember racialist means racist? The racist world concept, the racialist world concept, on the other hand, recognizes the importance of the racial component of humanity. In principle, it sees the state only as a means to an end, and its end is the preservation of the racial existence of mankind. So Hitler says that the whole point of the state is, and I quote, the preservation of the racial existence of mankind. In other words, he elaborates, racialist theories are far from believing all races are equal, but understand different races have inferior or superior merit along with their differences. This understanding obligates racialism to honor the universal will of nature that rules the universe and assists in the victory of the better and stronger, and to demand the subjugation of the inferior and those weaker. In principle, it acknowledges the aristocratic idea of nature and believes in this law's authority down to the last individual creature. God, you hear the same arguments from these people today. Racialism, Hitler tells us, recognizes that races have different values and are therefore, and there are different values of individual men. Out of the masses, we see the significance of the individual emerge, and this effect results in the organizing force of racialism and not the disorganizing force of Marxism. It believes the ideal of humanity is a necessity, since it regards the ideal of humanity, the completion of humanity, is a necessity, since it regards the achievement of this ideal as the sole essential element for the existence of mankind. Hyper-progressivism. However, it cannot allow an ethical idea to prevail if that idea represents a threat to the racial life of those who maintain a higher ethical ideal. In a world that has become bastardized and negroid, any concept of what is beautiful in humanity and noble, and any image of an idealized future for our part of humanity would be lost forever. In case you wondered if this is racist progressivism, that's what Nazi is. Yes, it is. Absolutely. But I want to come back to this one part, right? Out of the masses, we see the significance of the individual emerge, and this effect results in the organizing force of racialism, not the disorganizing force of Marxism. Okay? So I go back to my interview with Jordan Peterson, where he was talking about how we have some set of base rules for the game of society, and that erects a hierarchy, and that ideally, if you want your society to thrive, the natural hierarchy that comes from having fair rules that anybody can participate in, such that the base rules of the game aren't just fair, but that align with reality in the largest way possible. In other words, that you work very hard to align your game with two principles only: truth and justice. That's not what Peterson said, but that's what it is. If you want a successful civilizational game, your game must align with truth and justice. And then you allow a natural hierarchy to arise from the fact that it's aligned with truth will make it succeed, and the fact that it's aligned with justice will not only give you the best possible result because it's just and fair, but it also allows a just and fair participation by people, and they will rise according to just and fair methods, which are things like merit and demonstrated competence. And Hitler's like, no, because Marxism is a disorganizing force based off of this other world concept, we need the organizing force of racialism. So the base rule of the Nazi game is going to be racial, that there are superior and inferior races, and so that the entire societal game has to be organized so that the superior races rise to the top and the inferior races are subjugated. That's literally what he said, tied back to the way that I discussed it with Jordan Peterson in terms of two different organized societal games. This is the program. Human culture, he tells us, this is going to be the justification. Human culture and civilization on this planet are inseparable from the existence of the Aryan. So we got to take a tangent here in a second. His extinction or downfall would bring the barbaric, uncivilized ages on the globe once more. In the eyes of any race-based world concept, undermining the existence of human culture by destroying the one group that sustains it, is the most repulsive crime possible. He who dares to harm the highest likeness of the Lord on this earth offends God, the creator of this miracle, and is the cause of our expulsion from this paradise. So if you had any doubt whatsoever that the Nazi project was explicitly racist, there it is. And the pinnacle race is the Aryan, and the goal of the state is to serve the world concept, the racialist world concept. So you end up with a racialist state. And the point of the racialist state is to preserve and advance the master race. That is literally early 1920s, the point of the Nazi Party. So don't let these gaslighters and revisionists lie to you and mislead you about what the Nazis were about. There it is in Hitler's own hand. But the race that he names is Aryan. So we have to take a short side diversion here, but I don't want to take too long. Okay, who is the Aryan? Who is the Aryan? The Aryan, that doesn't sound like a German word. It's not. It is a Persian word that moved into Indo-Persia. The Aryan is the master, the fifth, not even the total master, the fifth race, root race, as Helena Blavatsky, the theosophist, the fraud theosophist. I'm not introducing this well. In 1875, a fraud named Helena Blavatsky created something called the Theosophical Society. I've talked on the podcast a lot about theosophy. And she did this in part by publishing her book, which she called The Secret Doctrine, which is almost 1,400 pages of insanity. I've gotten in some trouble for talking about the insanity of this book, in particular that she names Archangel Michael as the same character as Satan and talks about rituals for bringing it in, but that's not the point. This book is the book where the swastika came to Europe. And where it came in was through a racialist world concept, as Hitler is phrasing it. And her racialist world concept is that the human race is spiritually, not physically, broken into 5 root races. The bottom 2 are roughly animals. They're barely above animal in their functioning. The third one up is the workers. They're called Lemurians. So that's your working class, not your lumpen proletariat below it, but the working class. And then the one above the Lemurians are the Atlanteans, and that's your intellectual class, that's your bourgeois class. And then at the top you have the class that's really doing everything, and that's the Aryans. The Aryans are the 5th root race, the highest that humanity has to offer. They cluster very strongly in the Anglo-Saxon races and Teutonic races, according to Blavatsky, and way down at the very bottom of the pile, according to Blavatsky, are the Semitic races. And then the blacks are not doing so good, and the Asians sometimes rise up to the 4th, and she has this whole racial taxonomy about how it tends to statistically overlap with the external or exoteric races, but these esoteric races are in 5 layers. And the Jew is of the lowest racial quality. This is why Hitler is so angry about them, other than the German anti-Semitism and the other practical ways you can use that. And the Aryan, who Hitler decided was the Nordic ideal of the German, is in fact the highest, and they are the people who bring in the highest level of culture. They're the people who advance society through the most challenges, that build the greatest civilizations, again with high culture, and so on. And so Blavatsky's program is that you maximize the number of Aryans so that they can usher humanity into the next age of existence, which is the age of Aquarius. This comes from the Mahayana doctrine of Buddhism, actually, which is the collectivist, hands-on, transform the world into nirvana or something like that. It's the scary one. And it's total collective. We are all one, and we're going to force everybody to be all one. It's not about individual enlightenment. And so anyway, this is where the Aryan and the swastika come in, that Hitler obviously picked up. And Hitler picked it up from Helena Blavatsky, who was a crackpot occultist and Satanist, who said that Archangel Michael is the same as Satan, literally identical characters. Blah, blah, blah. We could get into all the stuff. And Hitler imported this. And so his belief, what this is for, and we'll hear a little bit more of that as we go on in this, maybe this podcast, but certainly in this series, is that the purpose of the racialist state is to advance humanity to its next stage of organization. In other words, as Blavatsky words it, but Hitler doesn't, to usher in the 6th root race through racial purity, through not mixing the races, and by advancing the Aryan cause. That is a beyond hyper-progressive, that is an occult hyper-progressive ideology that happens to also be shared by people like the United Nations today, and actually communists. The positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement would be their view on advancing to the next stage of humanity. The so-called 6th root race would be the socialist for them. And then Marx says that's not even the end. There are more. But I digress, because I've got a phone call I have to make. We're going to have to hurry up a little bit and finish the chapter. Therefore, Hitler tells us, the race-based world concept agrees with the profound will of nature. So it's natural law. We have to do this. Race-based world concept. That's what Nazis are. That's the political religion that must overwhelm Germany, that must capture the fire of the souls of every German. Not Christianity, guys. It restores that free play of natural forces which lead stage by stage, level by level, to a continuous improvement of the race by natural selection, until the best of humanity acquires its rightful possession of this earth and finally wins a free hand to rule, which will extend throughout the world and even beyond this world. Oh, there's the part where he says we're going to have the 6th root race. That's the point of the Nazi program. Let me just say that again. Therefore, the Nazi race-based worldview, along with all its practices, which is a political faith that is going to set the souls of Germans on fire, agrees with the profound will of nature. It restores the free play of natural forces which lead stage by stage, level by level, do I need to read out of the Corpus Hermeticum again? To a continuous improvement of the race by natural selection until the best of humanity acquires its rightful possession of this earth and finally wins a free hand to rule, which will extend throughout the world and even beyond this world. We all have a feeling that in the distant future, man may be faced with problems that are so big only an outstanding race and a powerful ruling nation which is supported by the entire world will be capable of solving. That's what he believes he's trying to accomplish. That's what good guy Hitler is after, to purify and advance the master race to a higher level of expression so that it can solve the biggest challenges for mankind by being the world dominator. It's obvious, he says, that attempting to impose such a general definition on the extensive meaning of a race-based Weltanschauung may lead to 1,000 different interpretations. In fact, there is hardly even one of our newer political organizations that does not fall in some way back on this concept of the world. The very existence of racialism, so everybody does it, so we have to do it. The very existence of racialism, as opposed to the multitude of other variations, proves there is difference in their concepts. The Marxist world concept, which is led by a unified head organization, faces a jumble of opposing views which makes little impression on the enemy's united front. Victory cannot be achieved by such weak weapons. Only when the international world concept that is politically led by organized Marxism is opposed by a race-based concept that is equally unified and equally organized and equally well led, will these two camps meet on even ground, and that's when victory will stand with the camp that has eternal truth on its side. Guys, this is literally the argument of the woke right. However, this is possible, only possible if both sides possess equal fighting energy from their members. The organized embodiment of a world concept can exist only if there is a precisely defined formula that lays it out. What doctrines are for religious faith, the party principles are for the political party. Remember, he's making a political faith. Therefore, a tool must be made for the race-based world concept, just as the Marxist Party organization clears the road for internationalism. The racialist movement needs a party organization that will allow it to take its rightful place in battle. This is the aim of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The party's ability to embrace and integrate the racialist idea into its own organization is indispensable for the victory of the race-based world concept. So he wants his worldview to win, which is the Aryan occultist race concept he got from the theosophist Helena Blavatsky, mixed with German anti-Semitism and German arrogance and pride in their own race. The best proof, he says, is a fact that it is admitted, at least indirectly, by those who oppose the integration of race-based ideas with party principles into a party unit. So that other people don't like it is the best proof that it works. Notice, actually, again, what's happening here in Germany. What is this Nazi experiment? I don't want to forget this before I get to the end. The Nazi experiment is we're having all these problems in Germany. Let's blame the free society and let's answer it by creating a race-based world concept and a battle-ready National Socialist organization, party, and program. That's what the Nazi experiment boils down to. The Aryan race project as the answer to not just Marxism, but the failures in their view of liberalism. So we have these problems in society, and the solution is to adopt the race-based world concept based on Helena Blavatsky's occult theosophy of race, and attached to the romantic mythology of the German history and the German identity, and to use that as the tool to try to take over the world in the name of stopping Marxism. And that the best proof of the fact that it works is admitted, at least indirectly, by those who oppose the integration of race-based ideas with party principles into a party unit. The very people who never became tired of insisting that the race-based world concept is not the hereditary property of an individual party and cannot be claimed by a single party because it sleeps or lives in the hearts of millions of people. People already feel that way. You know, I mean, the Christian ideal is supposed to be that you rise above your animal instincts, but anyway. Neither Jew nor Greek would be appropriate here, right? Maybe neither Jew nor German. But these people are proving themselves wrong, Hitler says, because the fact that this idea exists in millions has not stopped the approaching victory of the opposing world concept of Marxism. If this concept did exist in a clear way in their hearts, if we could make them racialist, the German people today would have already won a tremendous victory, and they would not be standing on the brink of an abyss. This is the woke right argument, guys. What brought success to the internationalist world concept of Marxism was the fact that it was maintained by a political party organized as an offensive militant storm troop. What defeated the opposing world concept was the lack of a uniform and united support needed to fight for their cause. A world concept doctrine cannot fight and win if it allows the unlimited freedom for anyone to interpret its meaning. It can only fight and win if it is clearly defined in the limited and consolidated form of a political organization. For this reason, he tells us, to close, I took it upon myself to sort out the extensive and uniformed substance of a general world concept and to remodel those central ideas into a rigid dogmatic form. That's his political faith. They called it Nazism. These clearly defined doctrines are capable of unifying the people who pledge themselves to these principles. In other words, the National Socialist German Workers' Party adopts the essential elements from the race-based world concept. Please let these gaslighters not deceive you any longer. The principles, he says, form a political declaration of faith by taking into consideration practical realities and limitations, the times we live in, and the available human resources as well as their weaknesses. This creates a closely knit organization consisting of the greatest mass of people possible, and it provides the basis for a fight to victory on behalf of this world concept, which was the racist world concept. So this is the backbone, my friends, of the Nazi experiment. The Nazi experiment was a reaction to a bunch of conditions that were bad and in some cases intolerable in Germany following the First World War, combined with a long history, vaguely, of various German identity concerns and anti-Semitism, which tracks back hundreds of years in Germany. It was this set of conditions that Hitler decided to forge together an experiment to fight back against the advancing of Marxism and to achieve something. We see what he achieved. It failed. But what he was trying to achieve is explicitly given here. It wasn't just to stop Marxism, which he actually failed to do. It was specifically to try to advance to the largest degree possible in the world the victory of the world concept that he put forth, the racist world concept that was based in the occultism of Helena Blavatsky and the secret doctrine, which he allegedly read quite a lot and thought was very important, which is where he got the idea of the Aryan race and the swastika as his symbols. And he adopted this model as the experimental solution to that set of problems. And so what happened? Catastrophe. Catastrophe beyond the likes that the world has ever seen, with the possible rare exceptions of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Great Leap Forward. These are the only things in human history that might compare to the devastation of World War II and the defeat, utter defeat of Germany and the Nazis and the Nazi ideology, which was this racist world concept at its heart, which again isn't even based in races, although he did say natural selection, so he's using what the Theosophists referred to later in derogatory terms as exoteric eugenics, when it was always meant to be spiritual or esoteric eugenics. You're concentrating Aryans and getting rid of the bodies that have inferior souls, not concentrating particular skin colors, as they explained later. But his goal was to solve the problems Germany faced by introducing the racialist world concept that held the German Aryan at the top and the Jew at the bottom along with the blacks and other inferior races as he saw them, to prevent racial mixing, as we'll hear when we talk about the next chapter, and to purify and advance the Aryan race so that it would advance humanity to its next stage of organization. And the result was not just a world war and calamity, but a totalitarian state of the worst proportions and, dare I say it, yes, of course, a brutal Holocaust. One of the worst things that has ever happened by humans to humans, on purpose. And we don't have to accept these arguments rehashed by the woke right today, and we don't have to accept the historical revisionism trying to cover up what happened in World War II to give these arguments a runway from which they can take off. We don't have to accept any of it. I said in the other podcasts about Hitler, and I'll say it again, never again is now. Never again is real, and we have to say no to this awful recycling of the Nazi experiment being foisted on us, and in particular on our young men.